Well, good afternoon. I'm the Professor. I'm back. I wanted to continue. I just listened to part of my previous one on the geopolitics of Canada and British Columbia in relation to many of the things I said about the preparations for war with the United States that went on throughout our lifetime that aren't talked about by our historians. And mostly, at least in my end of the country, I know them better out here. But the War Plan Red is the subject of the main, when I refer to the planned U.S. Blitzkrieg, without the plural on it, is referring to the famous War Plan Red, which the U.S. still has on its books. They still have it shelved. It's not something that's not it's on the shelf. It's not been canceled, but they don't need it now. They've bought us out. They bought our politicians. They have treaties where the border now is meaningless, thanks to a Bush-Harper treaty that is not talked about by our media, which is controlled by the United States. Thank you very much. It is. And there's no progressive media in Canada to speak of other than the web media and certain brave and noble blogs and vlogs. And I have not seen the other vloggers. I'm going to start looking around. I don't like to see a lot of the rank, like I had a rebel media one thrown at me and I watched it just to see what they were saying. And the guy was a Canadian yellow vest wearing a Make America Great Again shirt. And he calls himself a Canadian patriot. Oh, I'm sorry. If you know our history, then you know that this is an American seed. He may be just a brainwashed zombie, or he's maybe just, hey, we really like you, and he's been cultivated, and he's an asset. And to think that Americans don't have assets here in Canada is foolish. And obviously, the Manning Institute has been a platform for, how to correct the message that they were sent out onto the media to do, but they also have professional outfits that do it and are behind like the Cambridge Analytica style campaigns, which were no doubt behind the BC referendum, and also behind the election of our Prime Minister. I won't get into all that. The point is, back to the preparations for war. I'd mentioned I got distracted by talking about how important Halifax and St. John's were during the war, and they were very important. And so those troops that were there were very much needed to man the ports and supply the vessels. My own father was a torpedo instructor at Halifax and in Quebec City. He was from Winnipeg. They moved out here after the war. So out here in the West, yes, Japan was an issue in World War II, but all across Canada, Winnipeg, the strength of the ground forces, the mobilization, it remains strong. They were shipping people out, but not that many people went to Europe in either war. Well, lots went in the First War, and whole towns disappeared, and in Newfoundland, the whole generation. In 4 hours. Well, no. That stuff always makes me cry. Dieppe is a travesty of what the British used Canadian troops to do. Very similar. Oh, it broke a tie and eventually broke the trousseau. Is there much justification for Canadian military glory upon which our reputation and our national identity is built? BBC hammers it into us every year about our military bravery, but now that's been corrupted. We've been turned away from a peacekeeping nation, which Pearson turned us into, away from a British stalwart, a British imperial stalwart, which countless Canadian young men went and died, and women. Sorry, my parents were of that generation. I knew many of the survivors. So I'm not that old, but I've seen a lot, and I've been awake since I was young, and I read books ever since I was young. So I watch the news ever since I was like 16, 15. No, 13, 12. No, 12. Yeah, when Trudeau got the leadership of the Liberal Party, it was the first time I started watching politics. I'll go into that day someday. I was really excited. I thought he was a great guy. But he was an autocrat. He's an aristocrat. He's a very, very intellectual man. His son, who has a good education, but he's just not the intellectual acumen. All the political acumen of his father, including being a grandiosing fop, except he doesn't have his father's wits, and he's far too calm and cheesy for me. And apparently he's really charming. If I met him, I'm told I'd really like him. Bill Vander Zalm was the same way, though, right? And Gordon Campbell apparently was charming in person, too. Overwhelming personalities. People in politics, they have charisma. And that's why elected politics is dangerous, and direct democracy is much safer. You don't have personalities that can be used by the media to sell agendas that you don't want. So this isn't just about geopolitics. This is about how media and academia present reality, including history to you. The history of the province, the history of all the nations, the history of the world. And anyways, I'll try and focus back on the subject, which is that the preparations for war and the other things that I noted that I hadn't got into when I mentioned Halifax and all the importance of that, right, is that uh, especially World War One, right, ground troops were maintained, is the way I realize now that they're maintained in Canada because of the risk of U.S. invasion, and this had been planned. This is where the plural of the title comes in, where I added the apostrophe as a closed apostrophe, or not parentheses. You know what I mean? Anyways, so the other Blitzkriegs, plural, right, that were menaced or possible. And I put BC in the title too because some of these happened before this became Canada, when we were just Columbia, the Columbia Department, actually, Columbia District, the Pacific Slope, it was called, which was not the territory of the Hudson's Bay Company. It was outside British territory, and there were no treaties. It was in a suspended state. The reality was 1819 through till 1846 was neither Britain nor the U.S. had title, and other powers were welcome to be there, but they had what was called a condominium of interests. I don't know the terms of the language of the formal arrangement, but it's part of the Florida Treaty, which established the area as, north of the 42nd parallel and south of Russian America. The intermeeting area is a joint area of commercial operations by the United States and by a company chartered in London. Actually, the Northwest Company that was there first was chartered out of Montreal, and then they were forced into amalgamation with the Hudson's Bay Company because they were having a little war between themselves, kind of nasty. And all the Northwest Company people became part of the Hudson's Bay Company operations in the Columbia District. That became, when the area was partitioned in 1846, that became British Columbia, as named by the Queen, who said, well, realizing that the American Columbia was what they had, they call it Oregon, and they called everything up to the 54th 40th parallel, which bisected New Caledonia, which was the original fur district of the Northwest Company, had all the original forts, right, and other forts along the coast. They claimed it was all theirs, and that's the 54-40 fight that you still hear sometimes. We even heard it during the Salmon War in 1996, coming out of Washington State. It's still there, 54-40 fight. And yeah, it's geopolitical sense. And the reason the footprint of British Columbia is here is so that Britain would have its contact with Asia, its marine contact with Asia. It's what made Canadian Pacific the great shipping and railway force in land and minerals and forestry. The Canadian Pacific International is vast. I don't even know how much of BC they still own. I'm sure they didn't give it all away. Right, and now the BCR, Canadian National, is an American-owned company chartered in Montreal. Still Montreal money and Montreal stocks in Vancouver. They're all owned in the States, and a lot of it was Warren Buffett and Bill Gates when BCL was obtained by an American company through an illegal bidding process. That's a whole video that I'll get into another time. But back to the issue of where I was with War Plan Red and the other Blitzkriegs. During the Oregon dispute that I'm referring to, right, American settlers poured into the Oregon country over the Oregon Trail. It's a famous part of their national history, and you have the image of Manifest Destiny, this beautiful woman flowing above the wagon trains, leading them west into the wilderness. No, it wasn't wilderness. It was an ancient civilization with thousands of people, and they slaughtered them and killed them when they came in. Not right away. The Willamette colony, they didn't do much on the way in. They survived a lot, and they were at risk of their lives all the time, because of where they were in this very populous native region, which still hadn't been decimated by smallpox. There was a mortality in the 1830s. There'd been earlier waves of disease, and then the great smallpox hit there too, no doubt, right? But they also, by 1850, 62, there, when the smallpox hit there, they'd already slaughtered most of the people who were Aboriginal living south of the 46th parallel. The story of the Indian Wars in Washington State and Oregon and Idaho is really ugly, and it's interesting looking at native sites from down there. I'm looking on the various Oregon coastal bands and various ones. They have a different perspective on the history of the native bands here, because they've had a completely different legal history. They also have a different, what they've got, they have a completely different legal status. But they lost so much, and their numbers were, let's just not go into it, all right? But British Columbia was what was left. And now, without treaties, as it continued to be, although Douglas cut a few around Victoria and Nanaimo and Fort Rupert on North Vancouver Island, and also the Treaty 6, there's a Treaty 8 areas in the northeast, which are part of the Hudson's Bay related treaties east of the Rockies, even though that area wasn't Hudson's Bay because it's the drainage basin of the Mackenzie. So this is the Dana. I have a Dana friend on Facebook. I think he lives in Clecho or Decho. I'm not sure which one of the towns along the Mackenzie. And they don't have a treaty. They don't consider themselves part of Canada. They've been overridden. And I know a lot of my Slatlian friends feel that way. I know a lot of the Chilcotin feel that way about the New Halt. I had to say that straight out. So do the Halsey. Well, you're not part of Canada. Okay, well, let's put them on the damn map, okay? And just get it over with, and stop calling it British Columbia, right? British Columbia is a squat, so that's fine. We can name it something, Free Columbia, Cascadia North or something. I like Pacifica myself, so North Pacifica. It doesn't matter what we name it. It's not what's in the name, it's what's in the heart of the place. But the heart of the place is that we're in the jaws between Alaska and Washington. And as much as I'd like to see local self-government here and like a Swiss-style confederation, the geopolitical reality of North America is this thing called manifest destiny, right? And it's become manifest. It's become real, right? Because it was a dream of the Americans, and it's what drove them west to the Pacific. But it was always about all of the continent, all the way to the Beaufort. So fine. Alberta wants to be Texas. Let them sell their stupid junk to the U.S. and leave us alone. I like the Rhinoceros Party's old roll off the Rockies, and wall off the passes. I'd vote for the Rhinos if they were going to vote now. If we had PR, which would have been really interesting. We need more than just basic electoral reform in British Columbia. We need wholesale political reform. We need the Crown to be ruled as not being valid in British Columbia. That the police action currently underway against the Unistoten and Gitimat blockade in northwestern BC is completely illegal under international law, as the Crown has no authority in British Columbia, nor does the Premier have any authority to send in the RCMP, which are a federal paramilitary force that are on contract to the province, who were brought in by W.A.C. Bennett, I believe, because the British Columbia provincial police, who knew them all, would not brutalize the Doukhobors as the Premier wanted to do, so he fired them and brought in, this is my allegation, he brought in the RCMP. It's not a statement of fact, it's my opinion about that matter. He brought in the RCMP to do the arrests and intern the children and hunt for the children in the woods. Yeah, this went on in Canada, and went out with Native kids too. The Natives have all kinds of stories about the suffering of the residential schools. The torture prisons for their children that were trying to turn them white by taking away their souls. Okay, it's a horrible story. The true dark history of Canada. I debate what to call my channel sometimes. The true history of Canada, the dark history of the Great White North, but it's not really the Great White North. It's really the Great Red North with a thin white line along the United States, and that exploits the Great Red North. So, we need a lot more than just democratic reform. We need to come to terms to the political geography of Canada and reckon with what it means on the global scale. So I'm fine with recognizing that the U.S. would like that overland corridor to Alaska. It makes a lot of sense for them. I've never been particular about China being here, but I admire their tenacity and their skills and what their ability is such that it is. But, part of the issue with continental aggrandizement by the United States, which is inevitable, nobody can tell me it's not. They're not interested in Rust Bucket, Ontario. They've already got 52% of the place's trade, and they've got a pet weirdo as their, and he's got all the Lower Ontario. Lower Ontario has all kinds of Russian criminal elements in it, so you can't tell me that Doug Ford doesn't have any oligarchs around him somewhere, right? Or connections to them, or people sent by the oligarchs to work for him, or Americans of all kinds. This is what I was saying about nobody be naive that there are not American assets here, either compromised Canadians like this stupid idiot wearing a Make America Great Again shirt talking about the Canadian Yellow Vest movement, and they want to be, they're against immigrants, they want to build pipelines, and they want to hang Trudeau. Guess who's behind that? The site I saw, well, it was Rebel Media. And who were Rebel Media? Well, they're even worse than Sun Media, that who they replaced. They're as bad as InfoWars. Actually, I'm going to go after YouTube. I got to remind myself by saying this. I'm going to go after YouTube to ban Rebel Media. That they should be banned the same way they banned InfoWars, because it's what the Nazis called the lying press. The real lying press, or what they call the liberal press. I got to give the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Guardian credit, but the Guardian, the Guardian really disappointed me in their Gilets Jaunes coverage yesterday. They said there were only 25,000 people all over France. Give me a break. I've watched the footage, and I've done crowd control and crowd estimates, and been at big demonstrations and seen the police numbers and seen the media numbers and known the real numbers. 25,000, that was Paris alone. Or 5, 10 there. But when you add up Lyon, Paris, Bordeaux, there was more than that. The numbers are for France. The polls that I'm listening to, coming from the actual poll places, right, are that is it 75% of 80% of them want Macron to go. They have no confidence in him at all, and 75% of them want the citizens' initiative referendums, which is like direct democracy on the Swiss model, which is what I'm proposing for British Columbia. I'm not a politician. I don't want to be in politics. The media would never hire me as a journalist, even if I did be able to contain myself into 1,800 words or 1,500 words or whatever the proper length for a column is, and contain my language. And my sources are everything that I've ever read, and everything's published. And I had this idiot on Wikipedia. He was kind of trying to hobble me with anything I said by demanding line sites for things I'd known for 63 years that are part of school books and books I'd read over many, many years. And he's 19 years old and demanding line sites for me because he doesn't want me presenting my information. And he's a Texan. He's a Texan Chinese. I at times wondered whether he was an adult. At times I wondered whether he was a committee, because there was so much posting going on. And it was so politicized, the content, and biased. And only certain sources were kind of being allowed. He didn't want to look at any of the other sources I gave him. And was he Public Security Bureau? Or just a student on a scholarship who's his part for dividing ethnic division in other countries, and also setting up the Chinese history to make it sound like it was all bad and white people are all bad, right? So this is propagandists. There are propagandists at work on Wikipedia. I referred to them in my previous vlog. I won't go into that right now. Someday I'm going to deconstruct Wikipedia for you, and they're going to regret ever having blocked Skookum One. But that's fine. But they did that, but it released me from the constraints of their rules, what they call their rules, but everyone breaks who wants to break them, who has the clout or the slimy language to do it. So they're really all politicians. They're media politicians, a lot of wiki admins, okay? So anyways, they're propagandists, they're PR people. I think many of them are actually certain admins I can name, I'm sure, were certain operatives, either corporate or for certain political parties. Definitely for political parties in the case of the war with the Vancouver Sun articles who exposed me as though I was an NDP supporter. Jeff Lee of the Sun, I never did sue you, idiot. I really should have. Same with you, Vancouver Sun. Maybe I will yet. But lawsuits are how public debate are chilled in British Columbia. The blanket in British Columbia isn't just the media, it's libel chill. And also political beatings, like what happened to Dan McLeod, and then the lawyers, Jack Cram and Bruce Clark with an E, with the leopard skin glasses. Excuse me. That happened, but you've also got the use of media threats against the Georgia Strait to cut government advertising if they didn't stop having so much political content because they weren't like a newspaper because the government hadn't licensed it as one. And also my friend Dr. Robin Matthews of SFU, who was not informed properly of the movement of courtroom hearings. He was just a citizen, and he wasn't allowed to carry a tape recorder. A reporter would, and they arbitrarily convened a committee that's unconstitutional to do this, to block him from carrying a recorder so he could take proper notes. When the media were not, I'll guarantee you that I know because from what Robin says that what the media reported was entirely false, including Gary Mason at the Globe and Mail, who people think is a progressive. Same with Andrew Coyne, same with Chantal Hebert. They all think they're progressives. They're Canadian establishment clones. They're talking heads. They're part of the media machine, right? So, anyways, I'm getting very distracted now. But the back to the geopolitic that I'm to the United States and Canada, back to the Oregon Territory and how the Americans got it. They moved in. They moved into the Willamette Valley. Fort Vancouver was still there, and Governor our chief factor McLaughlin helped them a whole lot. And his son got murdered by two company employees, Métis employees at Fort Steen, and the trial was at Sitka, I guess, and he went up and so he got a really, because of Russian law, the two guys got off. He even saw them walking around Sitka, the people who killed his son, right? So he had no great love for the HBC, and he's sort of considered a great American patriot because it was him that helped the HBC not agree, but to take part. He joined with the Oregon colonists in the Willamette. That's all those. Or anywhere else yet. The Rogue River Wars hadn't happened yet. All the other wars hadn't happened yet. They cleansed the land of the natives. Cleansed is the word, and made it open for American settlement and militarization, and use for toxic waste dumps and nuclear plants and military bases and the massive armament that is Puget Sound, air and naval, and ground forces. And those ground forces were put there again. This is the geopolitics of North America. Those ground forces were originally put there. Not during the Oregon dispute, but after the Civil War. First by the taking of Alaska, and then they moved all kinds of guys into. They moved all Civil War veterans into Alaska, the parts that had been British Columbia, and then also into Washington State. Not British Columbia, Alaska. It's a difficult situation to explain that, but we had the British. It was British presence. Whether a British presence area is under agreement with the Russians. I think I explained it already. That the Americans moved their retired forces to, gave them land, and also established military bases, including at Tongass, which is the home of the home of the Tongass people who had been with the Masset Haida and one of the Tsimshan groups on a raid into Puget Sound for slaves that they came into a confrontation with in 1854. This is 13 years before the purchase. With the U.S. Navy and the USS Massachusetts. It's the first death in the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Happened at Port Campbell, Washington. Off Port Campbell, Washington. You got Haida warriors on deck with their crazy-looking helmets on and their war clubs made out of obsidian and jade and hardwood and bashing people in. This is how the Haida went to war. Anyway, so the U.S. Navy met its match with the what they called the Russian tribes. Because it wasn't determined where they were from. They just knew they were from the north, and that especially the Tlingit were from the Russian territories. But Russia was barely in control of the Panhandle at all, which is why they leased it to Britain. They were glad to just let Britain do the work in the Panhandle because they were better. The Hudson's Bay Company was better at talking to the natives than they were. And I guess I'm speculating, but they just stayed in Sitka and they took payments from Britain, and they got good dairy produce and vegetables and stuff from Fort Langley and Fort Nisqually and Saanich, originally from Fort Vancouver also. And they had their own colony in Fort Ross, which, it's kind of, I wonder what might have happened to that in a different equation with California if it had survived until the time of the gold rush. If the Russians had found the gold. And there's I have a whole thing about Rozanov in 1804 coming and falling in love with the daughter of the commander of the Presidio in San Francisco, and it almost causing a Russo-Spanish alliance over the Pacific. And the Russians would have settled the Columbia, which he almost sailed into. And yeah, all history is formed on hinge points, and ours is formed on hinge points of certain moments, and the Oregon Treaty was one of them. So back to the Oregon Treaty and the Blitzkrieg. So it wasn't a Blitzkrieg after 1846, other than south of the Columbia, where they went to war, and then north of it after 1846. But the only American citizen north of the Columbia to vote in the Oregon plebiscite that helped establish provisional Oregon and the Oregon Territory, and then Oregon as a state very quickly. Oregon became a state very quickly. 12 years, I think, since it was 1858. I'm not sure when Oregon was actually chartered as a state. Maybe it's 1848. Maybe there's that many people got there that quickly. But north of the Columbia, there was only one American. He lived in the Kitimat Peninsula. He had a native wife. And they conned him into voting for it. He was black. His name was George, get this, his name was George Washington Bush. But after the breakup of the Columbia Department and its emergence of the provisional government and of Washington Territory, the provisional government meaning Oregon, I'm referring to the state as it became a state, as I said, very quickly. But they didn't allow, they limited blacks the right to vote, I think, and own land. And Oregon was a really, really anti-black state. But they won the land north of the Columbia by using the vote of a black man who they betrayed by that vote, by using him to obtain that and then ban his people. If he was smart, I guess he never said, Governor Douglas, what do you think about this? Because Governor Douglas was nearby in Victoria at the time, and his men were over at Nisqually. Like, hey, you kind of should have known the guy, you'd think with the native wife, And what Douglas would say, he said, no, come back, because what, I think George Washington Bush he'd actually been a British subject already and then renaturalized as an American. So this is one of those hinge points in the Northwest. It's one moment. It's that provisional vote for the provisional government. Now, where the Blitzkrieg comes in is in two stages, three, really. During the Cayuse Wars and the Yakima War and the Puget Sound Wars, which included the raid on Puget Sound by the Russian tribes, as they were called, the Russian Indians, as they were called. Some of them were from BC, what became BC. The mainland of British Columbia was not yet a colony. I got to fly, and I got to notice that my battery is low. I'm looking at the fly. Anyway, so all those wars I just listed. The American genocide in the Pacific Northwest is an ugly story that most of the people that live there don't even know. And like the same here with the smallpox, most of the people here in British Columbia don't realize that there was a devastating plague here. And then, and it happened during the Civil War. The Americans were gone. There's all kinds of geopolitics of the colony at the time I could get into in terms of how the natives almost revolted and stuff like that, and almost slaughtered everybody at different times, in different locations. Didn't happen because wiser heads prevailed, or they didn't trust each other in the case of the thing in Lillooet in 1860. But wholesale slaughter was prevented in 1862 because the plan to kill all the white people was preempted by somebody getting smallpox in the camp, or somebody with smallpox being sent into the native camp. And the governor ordered them all home, and it spread the smallpox and killed half the population and 90% of the population of the Pacific Northwest, which nobody really knows what it was before, because the Hudson's Bay records are not considered accurate, and the oral records are huge, what the oral people, what they say are their own numbers. Anyway, so we're back to the U.S. and the Blitzkrieg. So the Yakima Wars, or the Cayuse War especially, was continuing, and the Cayuse Wars, and then the Oregon, the Okanagan Trail is part of the American Northwest history. But it's part of the British Columbia history too, which most Canadians don't realize, that British Columbia wasn't just settled by steamer to provide Victoria, but overland, large numbers. If it was 8,000 overland and 30,000 over by sea, as is the usual estimate, although there are some as high as 100,000 by sea. similar to the Klondike in scale. And you see a lot of men left the Fraser Goldfields quickly because the water was high. I said it's called the Fraser River Humbug, and they just went on to Colville or back to Colorado or down to Nevada. And we have this link to Virginia City because of that, because the Comstock was found by people who'd come here. And same with the Colorado stuff and Idaho, the Idaho Goldfields, and Colville was kind of interlinked with all the rushes in British Columbia. All the guys there had been at this one, and same with Hudson's Bay people too. So, well, the Niklapik people and other tribes had already, the Squatmik around Kamloops and others, and the Haida had already been mining gold. Already knew how to get at it, and were already selling it to the company. For them, it was already a trade asset, and they definitely did. Although people say, oh, they were just gathering nuts and berries and they lived in the woods, they didn't have a sense of government. I saw that again on a Vancouver Sun comment this morning. It's the same racist bullshit tune history. That they were, as Judge Buckern unfortunately said during Delgamuk versus the Queen. Uh, um, uh, He said that he quoted Hobbes and said that life for the natives was brutal, nasty, and about the very people who are standing on very civilized manner on a bridge, resisting, allowing work on a pipeline that they oppose in the same territory, the Gitxsan, the territory of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, which comes back to British Columbia geopolitics, is at the micro level. Each valley has a different set of geopolitics, and the geopolitics of the Northwest right now are at a point, and a military action is going to be taken under the guise of a police action in a place where the Crown has no treaties. Now, in starting this video, I'd actually meant to talk about the Alaska boundary and the Northwest mines. I'm getting a signal. I have a low battery here, so I should stop and plug this in. So I'll do the thing about the mines coming up, but all of these legal issues are coming to a head, right? And right now, it's a police action by a government that has no authority to send them in. Neither John Horgan or his Solicitor General has the authority to order the Mounties to do this. E Division is supposedly operating under their orders. You might be operating under Trudeau's orders, but it has to do with that LNG pipeline in which China has a share. And China, because it has a share, the FIPA agreement obliges Canada to take all means necessary, including violate the territory and lives and property of Canadian citizens. That term in diplomatic history, all means necessary, is a code word for military action. It's consistent throughout history. I've read lots of it. I've read A.J.P. Taylor's Diplomatic Histories and others, where all this stuff is the language of the treaties and the language of what it winds up meaning. So anyway, I have to end this, but give that some thought, what I just said. I'm going to have to try and remember all this, or I'll listen back and try and repeat this where I left off at, because I'm too low on battery. Maybe I'll just go in and plug in. Should I take my coffee? Yes. I've rearranged my chairs. So it's all a little different to get out of the seat, and I'm seated that way so I didn't have the sun in my eyes. I'm just plugging in. Don't mind me for half a second here. And seated down, and shutting my door, I guess. Shut my door. So where was I? I'm talking about the geopolitic of the American Blitzkriegs on Canada. So this was up. I was mentioning the Indian Wars in the United States and how ugly they were in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and so on, Montana. Although Montana still has a lot of native presence in it, and some areas of Washington do. But they were all herded around and relocated and stuff. In BC, their numbers were greatly reduced, and they weren't given the lands they deserved in many cases. And I've read through the Valley papers and the McBride-McKenna Commission, and in all cases, they were never listened to, and reserves were granted when people weren't even there, and and it was all about getting the peace. Same with the CPR and the terms of union. The CPR is a land operation. All railways are real estate operations. It's the CPR, as I mentioned earlier, is this huge real estate resource transportation infrastructure, thanks to the annexation of British Columbia and especially the violent conquest of the prairies. Now, there was almost a violent conquest here, but of a different kind. Because the Oregon Trail, which I was mentioning, which ran up the in the Okanagan River, which the Americans spell with an extra O, which we use an A, and that's for the same word. They came up the Okanagan River, and the trail went up the Similkameen for a while, and then there was a McLaughlin Canyon there. And the McLaughlin in question was John McLaughlin's son, the head factor's son, who had become a guide and translator, and like McLaughlin's whole family had become after his brother had been murdered, or was it his that was murdered? No, it wasn't him that was murdered. Yeah, he had a brother murdered, Sitka or in Fort Stikine. I told you the story about his father going up there. Right? So anyway, he was leading a party of Americans in there, and they ran into a huge ambush at McLaughlin. His name for him. And did he die there? I'm not sure. Is that why it's named? It's in historylink.org, which is a Northwest history site, which is excellent. I've asked them to cover more British Columbia history because we're the same history. But it's the same as with the Canadian authors until Dan Marshall and others came along to clue into, especially Dan though, to clue into that all the writings on earlier British Columbia history are mostly American, or as Dan and I have discussed privately, low battery, but I've plugged in. It says, there, see, and now it's plugged in. There, now it plugged in. It looked like it was plugged in, but it says 6% now, so I've got a few minutes. So anyway, the McLaughlin Canyon thing happened, and sad story about the McLaughlin family, but that's why they were pro-American. Well, that's probably why he was helping them do that trip. So, but after that, parties like another one called the Reinhardt Party that came into the Bridge River country and got kicked out by a guy named Hunter Jack. I'm going to do a video about once I get all pictures of him and the maps of the area together. But the Bridge River country is to the west of Lillooet on the Fraser, for those who aren't Canadian to know where those are, and are all from Columbia, and a lot of British Columbians don't know where that is either. Lillooet, you have to know it's west. It's between Kamloops and Whistler, basically, between Cache Creek and Whistler. So anyways, they came up the Okanagan instead, and the chief of Kamloops, he was amenable, helped them out, but he also chastised them because on their way up, many of the American parties that came out of Okanagan, I don't know, they raped and burned basically, or mostly burned. And the story from the I have to keep this low because of the length of the cord. There's a story from I'm going to do this. Untangle my cord. No, will I? Untangle the cord? No, it makes it more complicated then. There we go. Sorry, it made the cord a little tiny bit longer. The chief of Kamloops, the Slocan. I'm sorry, the Slocan. There was the Elgin Trail was a big problem, but about of the 30, repeated 30,000 going to I'm looking. I wish I could tell whether the thing was still. I haven't plugged in, but is it working? But yeah, it was the trail up the Okanagan. Of that 30,000 via the coast, they say 8,000 came overland. Well, it could have been a whole lot more. And there were parties that tried coming all the way from Fort Garry and the Palliser. Some guy was with the Palliser expedition. He got as far as the Okanagan or the Slocan or somewhere. He turned back home, went down to the States. So there was overland contact even from Eastern Canada by Americans. Well, the British were here, and a lot of the British who were here that voted to join Canada, they were the venture capitalists who acquired money in Oregon and came up and started newspapers, which were propaganda machines that have been political entities in British Columbia since the day this colony was founded, and it's still a colony. It's a media colony. It's a media fish tank. They experiment with advertising here, which is why the media industry had its start, because there was lots of skilled advertising crews here when they came to start making film. I'm just checking my power cord. It's plugged in, so I just have a shitty power bar, I think. My phone's still beeping. This phone still has its lights on, so this is working. It's charging, but it's just telling me it's low. So when this was going on, the interior nations of BC, cousins, not cousins necessarily, but yeah, relations between marriage relations between bands, which are many throughout the Northwest, and there were guys, chiefs with many wives, many peoples, including Chief Nicola, who had that sort of friend of the HBC, but they go back. His wives. I won't get into that whole history of the Nicholas War, but uh, he was at um, his wives. It's like 30, 40. Quishbestik. It means walking grizzly bear is his name in Okanagan. So he's the Grand Chief of the Okanagans, but he's having trouble as a young man running a little Hudson's Bay post at the head of the lake. Okanagan, it's called, which is where it all came from. Anyway, there was no fort called that there, but just it was just a post. Which he defended it. It was like a redoubt, like a fortress kind of. But his uncle was the chief of Kamloops, of the Squatmik. He said, "Look, I've got this valley where look up Douglas Lake and Stump Lake up there. It's a nice valley. Go up there, settle, right?" And so they went up there with the Okanagan people, the Spalman group, who are the Douglas Lake Okanagans, and then they're related to the Similkameen, so the lower Similkameen River, but also in the valley of the Squatmik, who are a branch of the Klotmik of the canyon and the Fraser and Thompson canyons, who are the main tribe in the area that I'm moving into, but who are very fractured politically and always were, other than during the Canyon War. And after the Indian Act and everything, the federal government manipulates people and shattered things, and they're not as coalesced or as powerful as they should be or would be or could be. But that's the whole nature of what was done to the natives all across Canada, but also in British Columbia, the Gik-San-Wet'suwet'en Confederacy, all of them. Many of them were forced into unity, like the Haida, because out of the 30,000 people in the Haida and Haida Gwaii at the time of the smallpox, there were 500 survivors. Of the Bararas, the Tsleil-Waututh, where Chief Dan George came from, of the 8,000 Tsleil-Waututh, there were 11 survivors. Reuben George said that. He's a great-grandson or great-great-grandson of the great Chief Dan George. So the American presence here has been strong. So what happened was that the Klotmik stood up to some American miners, I heard they were French. And another account, I thought it was Chinese miners who had raped a native girl near Lytton. And the reason that the Klotmik have the name the Knife Indians or the Couteau, it's not because of the cut nature of the benchland landscapes there. They could say it could be that. It doesn't. It refers to their preferred method of killing with knives. So, as in cutting heads off with them. So, there's miners downstream from where it happened, where they were killed. And they're panning, and headless bodies start floating by. Now, Dan Marshall knows there were more than those first two bodies. But anyways, there was this massive panic. But they kept on seeing getting more bodies come down the canyon. So Dan, maybe in a comment, if you could add how many there were, that'd be great. Or I'll look it up and add it myself. But in Dan Marshall's book, Claiming the Land, British Columbia and the New El Dorado, I have to plug it. It's the greatest history of British Columbia that's been written so far. Quite seriously. And Dan's doing another book on the Carnarvon terms, his articles in the Orca. And I know he's also doing another book on the Big Bend Gold Rush, which is a lost part of the 1860 British, that first decade of British Columbia history after the founding of the mainland colony. Anyway, so the Klotmik, this happened, and the Americans, and there were lots of French and Germans and many other Scandinavians, largely American, and about a third of the population, of the mining population, was Chinese. They'd already had their troubles, and the governor had come up in the bed and straightened it out. Like, you Americans, this is not California. They were starting miners' committees and stuff. No, that's not allowed here. And they sort of set up some justices of the peace who turned out to be really corrupt, and this little thing called McGowan's War ensued. But the Chinese, it's detailed in Dan's book and referred to in Lily Chow's Blossoms in the Interior, whatever it's called. Not very well, I say. I don't like her book, but the Chinese were dealing guns, but who wasn't? Like the Hudson's Bay certainly, and it wouldn't have been other than muskets that they traded properly. But Cowpels, who was the chief of Spuzzum, was a peaceful man, and yet his people had come under attack. They'd been mining Hills Bar when McGowan's boatmen at San Francisco showed up and started mining the other end, and they got in this little scrap, and that's when the governor came up, and how Douglas settled things, same as he did with Spentlam after the Canyon War. He made him a magistrate, give him authority. But the Americans never respected that authority, nor did they respect the first two government servants on the mainland, which were Juanel and Hills Bar, I think, which was in Juanel, a JP, and the other one was in in Yale was Hicks. And Hicks was also like a really, really corrupt official who was like selling licenses and dealing liquor himself. He was probably dealing weapons. You see, a man who has no morals will sell to anybody. So anyway, it doesn't matter how they got the weapons. The Indians have their own methods, in the trade networks. And even if they were just fighting with networks and bows and arrows, so the Americans and the Europeans organized in Yale, and they came through the Spasm Rancherie, which had been sacked, and then the 3,000 miners there. They convinced a radical group called the Radical Southerner group called the Whatcom County, to the Whatcom Company, to go up the other side of the river. They didn't want them coming with them. The Austrian company and Snyder, Captain Snyder's New York, the Pike Regiment, the New York Pike Regiment. So they must have had pikes, I'm thinking, but they'd been the Austrian company who was with them, led by John Centris, who since determined that that name is Slovenian, right? So I'm presuming that when it says the Austrian company, that he had been with the Austrian army. So I'm going to try and find an Austrian army historian to find out about that. But anyway, well, what I want to do is find the records of the non-Americans. Dan Marshall has done an amazing job in his book, Claiming the Land, British Columbia, and the New El Dorado. Don Hauka is also excellent, although earlier. And Dan's book is much more detailed. It has much more American sources and context and geopolitics in it. So what happened was they rallied these troops and they marched up the canyon. And they had to go up over this amazing Kikulis, this big summit. You had to come over the pass or whatever to look. They could see down the Whatcom County exterminated themselves one night. There was a shooting incident. Everybody shot each other. I don't know. I won't get into the full details of that. None of them survived. Apparently, Dan's book says. The site Dan has been able to determine is opposite Chapman's Bar. So Chapman's Bluff, we'll call it. There's a little rocky point of land where it happened. But anyway, they were high up on the mountainside watching this, up above Kikulos, which is the trail up out above. Kikulos is opposite Spasm. It's the trail up over the mountain that you have to take to get down to Boston Bar. They got to Boston Bar. And I don't know, I think they burned some food caches on the way up the canyon. But by the time they got to Lytton, the remaining 500 men, if that's what it was, not many, they were barefoot and they were ammunition. And what they didn't know, which it's in Don Hauka's book and also in Dan's book, that around them, an alliance of all the tribes of the interior. Remember I said about the Thompsons, the Nicolapic not being united? Well, they were united with the Nicholas, in other words, the Shqualtmik and the Shpaoman and the Similkameen, with Shqualtmik, at least the southern Shqualtmik, including the Adams Lake Band, who were very warlike, from what I know of their history and their relations. And I think it's them, forgive me if I'm wrong, Adams Lake Band people, but I think it was them that went towards the Stuart, who really didn't like having the Athabascans from the north living there. Where they came from and why, that's a question from BC history. I'm thinking they probably were Tsetsaut, which is the Jitsu, and they're called in Mishka, which are the people of Portland Inlet that had been Alaskan Tlingit slaves until given refuge by Nishka. And then they were warred upon by the Giksan until the survivors were given refuge at the Horde Pit of Portland Inlet. Right, there's all these little bits of strange history in early BC history. But this native alliance included the lake, meaning the Cynics. I was going to get back to what happened to Cynics in this situation with the gold rush. I'll get back to that. The Cynics and the Kootenai even came, and all the Okanagans, the Colvilles, the Paiutes, the Cayuse, the Methal. It's a vast alliance, and the Okanagan Confederacy itself is quite large. Not just the British Columbia bands, but Colville, and who they were then. It was very, very large. And I think John Howard's book said there were up to 17 or 18,000 warriors in the mountains surrounding. Around Lytton's kind of on a hillside on a sort of bench. And I didn't know the actual site of this. I'll go visit it up in Boston Bar and see the monument. And maybe if Mr. Snyder comes to the canyon again, he's a descendant of Captain Snyder. I'd really like to meet him. With Dan, I'm sure you'll introduce me. Or someone will. But they got there. They did not know there were 18,000 natives, armed. Didn't matter whether they had weapons or not. The Thompsons don't need weapons to kill, nor does anybody else. Everybody knew that, and they were also known. There was also known around the the native world. Of course, remember there was the depredations of the Silkameen Trail and the Okanagan Trail. That they were already well known. They already knew that these were called Indian fighters, all these pricks coming up the canyon. And Snyder, luckily, was a wise man, and I guess Centras, as a military man, was too. John Centras is a really interesting character, Dan. I'm speaking to Dan Marshall of UVic, that we need to find out more about him, find out who he was. Because I suspect that Mr. Centras, or Captain, is it Centras? He had a rank. Who was probably in the Fruit Wars in Nicaragua, which is where Nicaragua Bar gets its name from, I believe. The French is usually regarded as French, but French troops in Austria, and it could be, this is post-Napoleonic Europe. He could have well been as some kind of French general that had gone to France, but he was a military man, and they called the Austrian Company. Now, the reason I thought for that was because we have a lot of Belgians in BC history. At Lytton especially, the hotelier there, the Globe Hotel, Holtier is the guy's name, and of course we have the Oblates, who are mostly Belgians, the early Oblates. But in terms of the Austrian Company, various hoteliers and miners were Belgians, right? I guess Belgian mining, coal, I guess, is what they've got there in the Marne or wherever it is, or where the mining there is, Meuse or whatever. So you see, Belgium had been the Austrian Netherlands after the Congress of Vienna, until the creation during the Congress of Vienna, it became the Kingdom of Belgium in 1830. But by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, it was no longer Spanish. Dynastic inheritances and treaties between Austrian dynastic treaties, or wherever it had took place. But by that time, Austria was in control of the Netherlands, the Austrian Netherlands, rather than Spain, which had been during the establishment of the United Provinces in the Netherlands back, the wars of the 30 Years' War. I talked about it in my previous video about geopolitics of I guess you'd call that Baroque era Europe. I guess that's early modern Europe, the end of the 30 Years' War. But no, so this was, Centras, as a military man, would have been apprised of the situation of the U.S., and so would Snyder, who was a smart man, I think. And never mind the hicks from who were around Whatcom County, mostly Southerners, who had swarmed over, and they tried to build a trail to get to the Fraser. They found out it was impossible, and they wound up having to go on the river anyway, or around the back way through the Skagit. And in the Skagit, by that point, somewhere around there, or in the valleys around this, where the Skagit Range would divide off from the regular rest of the Cascades, which is, I think at Silver Hope, there's a valley that goes through. Somewhere along the way, at the 46th parallel, there were 2,000 U.S. troops, the Border Commission, and they were on red alert during all this. Now, Centras is somebody who was come up out of a war zone, and California had been a war zone, actually, in the insurrection against the Spanish. But also Latin America, and that's why they were there. They came to California and said, hey, we're doing their French imperialist bullshit, and maybe this, trying to think when Emperor Maximilian was brought in by Napoleon III. No, that was after the gold rush. So that French presence in Mexico. No, this is French troops that were in Central America with the Americans in the Fruit Wars or something to this effect. But these were guys who were in California that came up, and Austrian there, I think it's a catch-all for all Europeans. Not just for this, often called French troops. And yeah, there would have been a lot of French-speaking Belgians. French from France, I really don't think there were many. French from Quebec and Métis, yeah, there were lots, but they were generally company people, or like Buck Chaquette had come overland, or Buck Chaquette came up from California. He wound up in Sitka and as part of the Stikine Gold Rush. So, anyway, the war was luckily ended because Centras, a very wise man, I believe. I'll need to find out more about him. I hope if somebody does someday, or somebody who knows Slovenian history or Austrian imperial history. I mean, maybe he was a Slovene who was in the Austrian army in the Austrian Netherlands at Belgium, and so spoke French. And I got to go look at, I think probably there's a book called the British Columbia government put out in 1971, the centennial year of joining Canada. strangers entertained, and there's these chapters on each of the European ethnicities and who the original settlers were. I suspect he's probably in there as a settler or not, or as a business person. Uh, Gustavus Blindwright was a Swedish-British aristocrat, I believe of von Blind. Actually, I think he was a Swedish noble. And so when the canyon, after the Canyon War, I'll finish off the story of the Canyon War and then get on to the slow can. When the Canyon War happened, everybody panicked, and the governor met everybody in Yale. He burned the Snyder treaties because no American who's not sworn to the British could cut a treaty on behalf of the British. Only the governor could do something like that. So the treaties were invalid, but they did end the war and prevented American invasion by those 2,000 troops, and the inevitable invasion by yet more Americans who would have swarmed across the border. The 2,000 troops would have been followed by 20,000 Yahoo Americans on an Indian killing expedition all the way to 5440. So all my First Nations friends, people, you guys realize we got off lucky because David Spintlem was a wise man, and Captain Snyder and John Centris were wise men and prevented a war. Not just so that they could all peaceably mine gold, but prevent mass slaughter all the way to the Amanika. So this is the brutal realpolitik of these critical moments in British Columbia history. The Blitzkrieg that didn't happen. The First Nations of British Columbia are lucky that it didn't happen. That if they had wiped out those 500 survivors, and there were people at Kamshin, or Kamshin, I say Kamshin, but it's spelled now Cmchin. I'll find out how to pronounce it properly when I'm up there, what that A should sound like, because I'm good with parodying languages. I'll try and learn some Klapkin. It's the language. Anyway, so it's all a very interesting tale. But there was at Kamshin that day. It was a guy named. The name will come to me because he also Pahalak. I'm sure that was the name. Who also was the same name as Governor Douglas's escort through his Governor Begbie's and Bushby's escort through their adventures through British Columbia. He's never mentioned in Bushby's journal, but he was their constant companion and camping and bodyguard for Douglas. I don't know if it was the same guy that was at Kamshin. This is only a few years later, but I think it might be the same guy. Big and muscular, no word nothing but a loincloth, and he was the governor's bodyguard, or the judge's bodyguard. Now, Begbie was a big man like me, but he was an erudite. He did operetta, and kept pugs in Victoria and walked them on silk leashes and dressed in Elizabethan costume, sang operetta, and the ladies all loved him. He was a man of style, but he never married. So I'm not going to go into the good justice's private life, or just now. But Pahalak, there was a character at Kamshin at the meeting of all the chiefs, because it wasn't just Spintlem who was the chief of Lytton there, but other Nlakatmak, and I know where Pahalak was from, but other Nlakatmak were there, plus all the other, probably the chief of the Okanagan was in the same group. The major chiefs, the chief of the Nicolet certainly have been in this group of people, and he was advocating for killing them all. So the survivors, the barefoot survivors who were hungry. And Spintlem said, no, not a good idea. Not a good idea. We're not going to do this. Let's make a peace. So a peace was made, and the governor did burn up the treaty that Snyder wrote. And I'd like to know from the Nlakatmak, from the Lytton band, if they have an oral thing about what the treaty said. That would be really interesting to know. Dan, I hope you've thought about that. There must be an oral story about what was in the treaty. But anyway, it ended that risk. But Americans still didn't want to go into the knife country, into the country of the knife Indians, and so there was an alternate route to the Upper Fraser and the Upper Country, which they knew was gold rich, because when you find gold, there's a mother lode somewhere up there that you'd want to go find, right? So from Harrison Lake, which is sea navigable from Victoria, although they had their thing called the riffles at the opening of the Harrison River, there was a little sandbar thing underwater. The riffles got dredged as soon as Douglas did this. that he announced the construction of the Douglas. He was at Yale. He came up, met all the miners. He said, "Well, I have another way for you to get there. I have a route that we're going to build. It's called now the Douglas Road or the Lakes Route, the Harrison Lillooet Trail. And the Lillooet name at the time did not refer to the destination at the town of Lillooet. It referred to the use of the Lillooet River Valley as the trail from Port Douglas. Hatsa, the reserve is still there. It's called Hatsa. Well, no, that reserve wasn't there then, but that's a longer story. I'm moving this a little bit. There we go. I'm thinking of my lunch I left on the stove, which I'll talk about before I'm done. Hot set, but anyways, so there were so many men. I think 10 crews or 25 crews or 25 men each. 25 crews of 25 men each. Each organized according to ethnic lines for the convenience of the working parties. One in Chinese, one in Norwegian, one in Danish, one in Swedish, one in German, one in the Americans worked together. There were sections that Britons worked on together. Some sections were well built, others you could barely find them. During the building of it, maybe the reason they couldn't find them when the Royal Engineers came through years to spruce the trail up a bit, they couldn't find them was because in Mosquito Pass, which is the old name for between Pemberton and Darcy along the rail line and the road to Darcy there in Birken, and yeah, I can see that area we call Hindu Flats. I can see the bug problem. Oh yeah, it drove men crazy. Them streaking away from their work and into the woods, mad, insane. But you get past that, there's no mosquitoes. You get past, well, there's mosquitoes at night, but not in Lillooet End, there's no mosquitoes left. So people went nuts. But anyway, 30,000 people went through there in a month, maybe more, because we don't really know how many people were in Yale. And it was, stretchers of Cayush, which Lillooet before 1860 are sketchy. I'm trying to find out more. This is why I want to try and find, which is why I tell you the story of who worked on the Douglas Road and sources. I want to find letters or diaries by the guys who worked on the Douglas Road, whether they're Norwegian or German or Chinese, whatever groups of people. There were Portuguese here, there were Italians, no doubt, who worked on the road. So probably the sections of the road that were well built were probably, I'm guessing, the German and so on and Italian ones, because they were good road builders. Chinese were too. But the Chinese during the Douglas Road also, they had the freighting companies. They were the earliest freighting companies established in BC. Were at Port Douglas, not Yale. And there were steamboat companies that had Wells Fargo and stuff were around already, and Hugh Nelson and Barnard had already cut a deal on the Fraser River traffic. Barnard had all the upstream traffic. Hugh Nelson had all the downstream traffic. Or maybe Barnard was now partners on the run to Victoria. So they both became lieutenant governors later. Nepotism in politics is how the colony is run. It's what we are. It's where our, quote, nobility comes from, is capitalists that had clout and did things. Anyways. So out of all those records, remember I mentioned Gustavus Glen Wright. The Caribou Road, the original one, not the one from Yale, but the one from, and I thought it was from Cayush, but no, it was from, we say Lillooet when we say where it started from. Lillooet has a monument downtown saying this is where it started from. Well, no. The Caribou Road, the original, very original one, started from a place called Parsonville, which is just north of the current bridge of the 23 Camels across the Fraser. Just north of it, there was a little thing called Sugarloaf Hill, and there was a little town built there, another one called Marysville. But Parsonville is where a lot of the first, when you visit business directories for BC, you have to look at Parsonville to also look at what's in the also look at Bridge River, because there was another little town where the Bridge River is, and I think I've figured out where the site of that bridge was. And there was like 3 or 4 boom towns in the area that are gone, including Upper Fountain, or the Upper Fountains, which is the site currently of the highway strip. And junction with the Fountain Valley Road. The Fountain people of Hathlet have 8 miles from Lillooet. Anyways, so that Caribou Road, he was Scandinavian, and I know that the Scandinavians worked on the Douglas Road, the Danes and the Norwegians and the Germans also. So guess who he hired, other than natives and Chinese, because he hired them too. but to work because they were good road builders. But I'm thinking that the Norwegians also, so I speak a little Norwegian, you see. I can kind of read Danish and make my way through Swedish if I have to, learning Icelandic. Uh, but but the Norwegians would have been on that crew, and I'm wondering, there were some who worked in the Bridge River country. They're mentioned in a very excellent book by Lewis Green, Lewis Green from Tricounie, Tricounie, from published in 2000, called "The Great Years: Gold Mining in the Bridge River Valley." It's a fabulous book. It covers everything from the stock speculations to the personalities to the geology to all of it. It's a beautiful book. I hope that an upcoming book about the Bridge River project is going to be just as good. This is why I'm addressing this to my friends who are from the Power Pioneers, who are BC Hydro veterans, who are doing a book on the Bridge River project in which I was raised. And that's my home country. It's where I'm proud of. I won't be moving that area. Similarly dry, but not that area. But that was a critical area of BC history, and I think that the perhaps some of the guys in the Bridge River country who built the Little Gun Lake Lodge and the first couple of mines hotels in Berlin were stunning works of architecture, like woodland, well not woodland, but wood craftsmanship. Well, it was Norwegian guys that did that, right? The same with the coastal fishing villages. They look like Norway because they were built by Norwegians, right? So the history of Norwegians in BC, there's a lot. It's pretty rich, and I think there's probably a lot of resources in Norway. Just haven't had the time to write the various people in Norway and maybe get my language better. Even without that, they all speak English, but say, look, do you have any family that were in the California Gold Rush into British Columbia? Could you please let me know if you do, right? Because I want to find guys who worked on the Douglas Road. I want to find guys who were into the Upper Bridge River in the earliest days of the 40 Thieves, who were the first 40 prospectors that Hunter Dock led into the valley after driving out the Chinese, also driving out the Italians who led in by Reinhardt, the German I mentioned who came up the Okanagan Trail. And the Reinhardt expedition account is online somewhere. I'm going to find it. I guess I'll try and post it in the comments after I get the time to listen to this and remember to all the little mental notes and the things I said I'd linked, right? So I mentioned the slow can, which I'll mention before I go because I should end this. I do have food waiting, which I should eat, and I see I'm already at an hour and 7 minutes. I could talk all day. It's an awful thing. Anyway, so what about the slow can? Boone. Boone, no, not Daniel Boone. Not Daniel Boone, the other Boone, the cannibal. Helm Boone. Is that the phrase? Is that the name? Helm Boone? So where's he from? Kentucky or Arkansas or something like that? He killed his own family and ate them, and he made his way across the West. You know the film Dead Man Walking uh, by Jim Jarmusch, and it has what's his name? Pirates of the Caribbean in it. As this guy, the superstar with funny ways and the reputation. I'm sorry, I can't think of the names right now. But yeah, he has this guy who's dying, and he winds up in the wilderness. He eventually gets to Maka country and is given a burial ceremony. But he's a dead man walking. He's fated to die. But he meets Boone Helm. There we go, Boone Helm, a character modeled on Boone Helm, which in the film is played by Iggy Pop, who's in a granny dress, and they're cannibals. Well, Boone Helm came across the American West and did a lot of nasty things. And the cynics have this story of the first white men to come through the valley, and Helm was sometimes not alone. Came through the Slocan Valley. They didn't just kill and burn villages; they raped women and children and ate them. And their numbers were greatly reduced by Boone Helm. Is what Boone Helm was who did that. So this man made it all the way to Barkerville. So British Columbia is part of the American West, people. You Canadians east of the Rockies, listen up. Our history is their history. Your history is their history. Our history is your history. Learn British Columbia history or lose us, because that's what's going to happen. But you're losing Alberta anyway. Now, the Yellow Vests are a joke, but it's part of the whole American operation to overtake Canada, either through media ownership or media brainwashing or just setting the stage for political agitation. Yes, the Russians are probably active here, no doubt. And the Chinese, definitely. in terms of their intel operations. But that doesn't mean that the Americans aren't in here. Good God, no. Who else would be in here? We're their empire. We're the other half of them they don't have yet. But what we have are puppet governments. There's no free trade in people, is there? Well, that's all good because it means no free trade in guns too. But one day that thing with the free trade in guns, it won't matter whether they have a civil war or not. Because the plan is, and the inevitable plan is, and I've put it this way, is very simply, is I-25 from Denver to Fairbanks, via Calgary and Edmonton and Fort St. John and the Liard. And I-15 and I-5 being extended northwards as far as they can go, and then take over British Columbia unless the unsurrendered territories can obtain their sovereignty internationally, which I recommend. And towards that end, I have an even more radical idea. Partly because there are treaties in southern Vancouver Island, and so the land is already alienated, which means it no longer has Aboriginal title. But the Americans have, for a while, the bad kind of Americans, have wanted the UN to leave New York. Okay. Toronto and Montreal have been talked about because they're internationals, they have hotels and all that, international services. You know, imagine the traffic in Montreal or Toronto with the UN there too. Oh my God, right? Anyway, so let's not go there. Why don't we do that on Lower Vancouver Island? You know, up Sioux Hills maybe? And do it as an environmental engineering showcase, you know, that it's all eco-friendly, well above tsunami line, on bedrock, with independent water and totally geothermal powered, not part of the grid. Like, do it properly, do like an advanced engineering project. Ask the embassies to minimize the sizes of their staff, you know, and give them an environment. You'd have to have a security compound, you know, because of all the embassies. Unless Victoria, I don't know. I guess Victoria, there'd be places. It would certainly be good for the Victoria real estate market, you know. It would certainly add prestige to the office of the Lieutenant Governor if it survives the reforms of British Columbia, which I think should come. Or the nature of that office has to change substantially as to how it manifests the sovereignty of British Columbia via the Queen. The Queen has to say, okay, I recognize your sovereignty. That's your job, Elizabeth, William, Charles, you hear me saying this? That's your job, to recognize the sovereignty of the First Nations and get the governments to cut it with all this bullshit and live up to George III's promise of the Royal Proclamation. Are you hearing me, Royal Family? Do you want there to be peace in Canada? Do you want to be just for the First Nations under terms of the Royal Proclamation? And because you care about them, I think you do. I think, William and Kate, you had a nice instruction for your kids, and I hope your kids come back, grow up in Haida Gwaii for their summer holidays and get away from all the bullshit and become human beings. So anyway, back to Boone Helm and the slaughter of the Slocan. And yeah, a lot of crimes happened in the Caribou, more than people realize. Anyway, Boone made it back to Oregon. I think it was the Dalles he was hanged at, but I heard somewhere else, it was somewhere else in Oregon that he got hanged at. He eventually got caught and hanged, you know. And he's one of these guys like Picton or Clifford Olson, who are famous serial killers here in BC, and Bundy in the States, and the Green River Killer and all that. Nobody's sure exactly how many people they actually did kill. And Boone Helm had like a pretty impressive record. I think it's in the 80s of people that he killed. And if he killed all the cynics too, it could be in the hundreds that he killed. So the cynics, I've been taking oral legend at face value anyway. We call it legend to discredit it and treat it like it's primitive, unproven material. But no, oral traditions, as I've know from studying the classics and Norse classics and other classics, you know, they preserve the geographical record really well. Right, and this would include the claims that in places like Mount Currie and the Bella Coola region, not Bella Coola itself, but the King Island, Dean Channel area, Kemsquit, all that. That was all 35,000 people there, 30,000 or more in the Charlottes. Again, Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en Confederacy, 400 years old. Like the Mohawk Confederacy, all of these are sovereign countries here. They're unrecognized by the international community. They should be. And there's this fiction called British Columbia, currently sending in troops from the federal paramilitary, who they use as a police force, to enforce an illegal building of an illegal pipeline, illegal under Wet'suwet'en law, and environmentally questionable and economically inviable, and a stupid project. Instead of investing in other things that the government budgets could be going into debt for, cross territory of unsurrendered nations who are determined to fight it. So we always thought that the Northern Gateway pipeline was going to be the one to cause the violence that Blue River or Coldwater become a flashpoint like Standing Rock was, when Burnaby Mountain has at times been, right? But it could just be that the old route of the Northern Gateway, which is the route of the LNG pipeline, more or less, is the one that touches off the next Gustafson Lake, which was a police encirclement of a guys building a Sundance Circle. 4 guys, natives building a Sundance Circle 100 miles west of, or somewhere near 100 Mile House on the Caribou Highway. It's a place called Gustafson Lake, Tibetan. The media was suppressed, like it always is in British Columbia. The RCMP, who are part of the political apparatus of the British Columbia Liberal Party, and have actually a board member who's married to someone somewhere on the senior Mountie is married to someone on the board, and you know the Staff Sergeant Montague collaborated with Gordon Campbell in persecuting Gordon Campbell in 1996 to drive him from power and to help Campbell get elected, and so on. I've always gone into this in my other vlogs. So the RCMP have their own political agenda. So whether Horgan's ordering them or Trudeau's on them to do it, or whether whoever the boss of E Division is taking orders from the United States, which is also how I believe how Ms. Mung got arrested, because Mr. Trudeau did not know it was going to, no, he was told it was going to happen, that there was nothing he could do to stop it, is what Mr. Trudeau was told. And why was he not able to stop it? Well, remember I said that Mr. Bush and Mr. Harper signed these treaties with military access. It also involved policing and court and extradition. And so when they say that, well, we have this treaty with the United States, yeah, but which one and who signed it? And remember, this is my problem with the one-man government of representative democracy, the same as Macron, either Trudeau, any of Mulroney, that we have this one person, Oregon, Christy Clark, Gordon Campbell, we have one person in charge of a government. We have no control of them other than that one vote that we are giving them. Waving my hand here, that one vote with that one vote. That one vote is all you have every 4 years to get rid of the prick, and then you're sold on it being something else you're lied to, the media lies to. So it's all based on personality. So when somebody charismatic like Mulroney or Campbell comes along, either of the Trudeaus, you know, that's what they look for in political leadership, is somebody to manipulate the media with and manipulate people into telling lies, like Mr. Trudeau has done about electoral reform and taking the side of the natives, you know, and not doing the pipeline when he's doing it, to the point of where he's. It was another comment on that, maybe that same article about, you know, that Alberta has a right to export its build pipelines. No, it doesn't. You're a landlocked country. You don't have a right to build a pipeline anywhere. It has to be granted, and the First Nations have not granted it, and they are a sovereign. The First Nations of British Columbia are sovereign. This is the final analysis of the geopolitics of British Columbia. They are sovereign. Now, the American geopolitics, in terms of it becoming an American corridor to Alaska, that can all be resolved so long as all those sovereignties are recognized. We should recognize them now. No reason not to, really, no, other than to be obstinate and hire more lawyers. The lawyers love all this. They're making all kinds of gravy off this, taxpayers. Oh, are they? Oh, man, they're enjoying this. You know, so you know, the Icelanders banned politicians and lawyers and bankers from taking part in the writing of the new constitution, but do we have the spine to stand up like the Yellow Vests are doing and face rubber bullets, face the risk of an American invasion, which is one of the other Blitzkriegs that I mentioned. I mentioned War on Red and the risk of the Canyon War and the entry of the Border Commission troops that would turn into a slaughter up all through what they would call the Oregon country, all the way up 5440. Would have been nasty. But also in 1983, we had troops massed at the border preparing for a general strike here in British Columbia, which, you know, there are no Canadian troops for. And Premier Bennett was challenged by a broadcaster named Webster, which we back around more. Jack's one of my inspirations in journalism, I guess you could say. Not interviewing, but I don't think I'd be able to handle an interview, but doing this kind of thing, you know, explaining things and seeing things clearly is the whole point. Socratic asking. So we asked Bennett, what troops? Because there's nobody at Jericho anymore. There's nobody at Chilliwack anymore. There's nobody around BC's bases anymore, not since the war. Well, the 2 divisions of U.S. troops in the newspaper in Cedro Woolley, which is in Skagit County. Well, if we talk about 2, there's 5. I said this earlier. But on the other occasion of But it would have been a blitzkrieg. It would have been like Chile. They would have rounded up people like I was Green Party, NDP. They would have rounded up all the socialists in the country. They would have had themselves a little killing and beating and torturing spree. That's what they love to do. It doesn't matter whether we're white or not. Look at Chile. And that was just a few years before, just 4 years before. We were all aware of it. And that's what made us back off, a threat of American invasion. And Mr. Trudeau, the senior, would have to be okay with it. And Bennett would have had to clear him with it. And Bennett just had this little wan smile when Webster had him. That was Bill Bennett's reaction. It's ugly. But the other blitzkrieg, after the Civil War and the U.S. annexation of British Columbia and Alaska, let's call it that, British Columbia and Alaska was seized by American ex-military, and troops bases were founded where the Russians had never had bases. Anyway, so that happens. That wasn't a war, but came close to it, and there was the putsch. They took the San Juans, 1859. The arbitration gave it to them, but that was another putsch. Threats of violence. And in the Bering Sea Crisis, if there'd been a war between Britain and the U.S. over the seizure of the British Columbia sealing fleet and the British this is the episode that the Seawolf is based on, the sealing fleets. They're from San Francisco and Vancouver and Prince Rupert and so on, and Alberni, and they were in the Bering Sea sealing, And remember, the whaling fleet was here too. There was a big whaling fleet here at one time too. Lots of old whaling towns that had gone. And again, the Scandinavians would have been big in that. So the sealing fleet there seized. So that's the Seawolf, is about that. Well, with Britain and the U.S. almost at war in 1885, again, I'm going to have to see and look up about the building of bases and the movement of people in Washington and troops in Washington and along the Canadian boundary all the way to the Atlantic, because in the event of that going on with the U.S. seizing British ships, they must have sought to prepare for war, including what became War Plan Red. But the same concept, that they were prepared for general war against Britain. It would have been war in the Canadas, Ontario and Quebec. It would have been war on the maritime front with Maine and New Brunswick. It would have been war, and they would have tried to seize the I won't say the Midwest, the Nordwest, Real's Nordwest. But yeah, so this was in British Columbia necessarily, because this is where the sealing fleet came from. We have all the gold. And by that point, 1871, the Cassiar was rich, and they knew there'd be other rich finds in BC, and there were. The Americans knew about the gold. They knew about, then they wanted that corridor to Alaska. So, of course, 1885, there would have been a mobilization. In 1866, we almost got given to them. I think, did I mention this in this video already? Britain offered them to us. Offered us to them. Excuse me, the burp. Offered us to them. Now the Yanks took $15. It felt like, might as well have been $15. They took $15 million. They paid 50 for Alaska, or 60, whatever it was. So that's how much Britain didn't value us. Which is why there's only that little tiny railway footprint that we've got left. They just wanted that railway. So they got it. They retained it. That deal must have carried with it some kind of deal of shipment through Vancouver, probably. That agreement, that suggestion that, well, they didn't have Vancouver yet. They didn't have the railway yet. See, this 1866. So what they did in 1902, 1901, 1902, whenever it was, Roosevelt threatened to invade. I don't have time to look through the historical newspapers to find the coverage, but they are online. The historical newspapers of British Columbia, Vancouver Public Library is online. But so where would that same action again, the War Plan Red scenario of an invasion across the line, which must have been started planning in 1885, sketches of it and thoughts of it, and there's stories on that dickshovel.com/2two.html website that is about I think it's 1885. I don't know which. I think it was McKinley, but whoever was the U.S. president at the time was talking to Riel. That the Americans said we had a thing going with Riel, as on that website. The geopolitics of Central North America were very much at stake all the way along, and so 1885, there would have had to been, this is the Indian Wars are going on across the line. The U.S. hasn't secured the Montana Territory or the Missouri Territory, and it hasn't secured the Dakota Territory. All they just kept on subdividing it. They still haven't secured it yet. So, but against the Canadas, they had lots of troops in Michigan and Ohio and New York. Bam, into the Canadas. As I say, Halifax is a stupid idea to invade. You can't really do it. So is Esquimalt. Esquimalt, you could do a naval blockade of. The railway didn't exist yet. In 1902, it did. And this brings me to my closing point now: is the consolidation of American power in the modern era, the clinch hold that they have over us, and that we're tied in with them, like the problem with Alberta talking about shutting off the gas to Washington. No, cutting off the gas to BC means cutting off the gas to Washington. That was bright, Alberta. And what's that got them thinking about? They want the control of that pipeline. They don't want a pipeline built to China that's going to triple their rates, you stupid Canadian politicians. Harper signing a deal with China and then the states that conflict with each other, you stupid asshole. Right? There's such neophytes, right, on the geopolitical scale. On the geopolitical scale, the inevitability of the situation is quite clear. But now also what concerned me when the geopolitic that was going on between Putin and Trump was getting more and more evident, and I read this thing, or watched a thing on the Soviet closure of airspace and how airlines from East Asia had to use Anchorage. Anchorage was one of the world's busiest airports for many years. Alaska was very important geopolitically in the air industry and geostrategically in the air industry. Had huge hangars, hundreds of planes, I don't know, dozens of planes at a time. One of the world's busiest airports, because to go from Europe to Asia, you couldn't go through over the Soviet Union or China. You had to go around them. So they'd fly over the pole to Anchorage and then to Tokyo or Hong Kong or wherever. There was one flight that was a Korean Airlines. They actually didn't use Anchorage. They went around the Bering Strait. They actually detoured around and then back around, and they made it to Europe that way, I guess. I don't know which sea. But then with Trump and Putin getting together, and what I saw immediately as pressure, and it's continuing on Canada, economic pressure and political subterfuge in Canada, including Doug Ford and Mr. Scheer and Mr. Kenney, and the Canadian Yellow Vests, and the Manning Institute. American subterfuge in Canada is quite thorough and quite extensive, and the media control. Not just the major media, but also the minor media control, and also the control of the corporate stocks of companies like CN. And the American companies that now can still, because they have Canadian proxies, they can make political donations. Great. All the rules have been written to favor all the crooks, okay? Government is organized crime. It's an old joke, but it's not a joke. Government is organized crime. Right? Historian Colin McKeevity in his Atlas of Medieval History makes a nice joke about it. That the Norman dukes, and the Normans basically turned an extortion racket into the foundations of central government for England and France. And that's what we have, the Domesday Book, keeping of records, all that stuff. But that centralized thing, you give us your money, we're going to beat the crap out of you. Yeah, and keep your mouth shut or we beat the crap out of you. So we have a monarchy we live in next to a republic run by, thinks it's a monarchy, with a bunch of people that had, centuries-old civilization here with their own forms of government who are stoling the ground against it. But what happens when, say the Americans get all the way to the Beaufort? Maybe that happens even after Mr. Trump done. I don't think Mr. Trump has the wits to do it, although the Albertan separatists have minds of their own. We'll see. And the media like this game. The oil industry would like it. They'd like it. They wouldn't have the political control over Alberta that they do now if Alberta became a state. Maybe more. I don't know. Maybe more. And Yukon, we'll see what happens in Yukon. But so far, America, despite the growing tensions between Canada and the United States, and I can fly to Mexico, even though I can't enter the United States, that airspace, the closure of American airspace would seriously harm Canadian tourism and Canadian commerce and the free movement of Canadians around the planet. That we would have to find solutions like the Anchorage situation, that Vancouver, if we don't retain it as as an international thing, part of an American-Russian lockdown of the Northern Hemisphere polar airspace. Denmark has a chunk of the airspace. So far, we do too. We don't do much with it. We don't keep our own Air Force up there. But if the U.S. takes Alberta and the Northwest Territories, the pressure on Nunavut is huge. Right? We don't have a Navy worth spitting on, or Air Force worth spitting on, even though we're going into huge debt for Lockheed to buy some jets from Lockheed Martin for an extension of the same bullshit payola with big military war industries that Harper government was about, and right down to the Lockheed Martin scandal and the contempt of Parliament and Nigel Wright going back to Onex, who I think handles Lockheed for Canada. I mean, the nepotism and the incestuousness of corporatism and the political parties, and not just the Tories, also the Liberals. The Canadian establishment party system is meant to serve the corporate elements. The NDP are meant to serve the unions. And the NDP don't help out the poor. Don't I know it? And they don't like the Greens, and they're not really environmental because they believe in building pipelines and dams and more houses and having more people and bigger pensions, and to do bigger pension you need more immigrants. They're not interested really in human rights, so they've always claimed to be a progressive party, and they were compared to the Social Credit. Yes, they were. And compared to the Liberals, yes, they were. They are. But not in their treatment of the Greens, not in their regard for the First Nations rights, as is going on right now in Burns Lake and Smithers by them massing troops to attack. It amounts to an attack on the Gittimden and the Unistoten. So this is the Indian War that's ongoing in Canada. It continues at the very hour that I'm speaking. I feel like retitling this and putting that in the title, right? That along the northwest boundary also you've got the Tulsa-Q and Red Chief and Alaska don't like it, and that boundary exists and has prevented the development and settlement of interior British Columbia, really one of the nicest parts of BC, because we never had access to it. And had the Americans had taken the Cassiar, they would have been a lot richer. Alaska would have been, during the Klondike, they claimed that Whitehorse and Atlin were at the New York bylines, from New York Times bylines from the gold rush, say Whitehorse, Alaska, Atlin, Alaska. They say this in the New York Times headlines. So anybody who thinks the Americans are our friends, I like my Washingtonian friends, but remember a lot of them are military too, that when the time comes, they might be under orders. But we're a walkover, please just bring flowers, just say, look, we're taking over. You guys don't have a choice in the matter. Don't start shooting. But they'll still round us up and stuff. So I don't know. I'm kind of glad to be I'm 16 miles from the border right here. Literally 16 miles to the line, almost to the mile. Whatcom County. So I'm moving up the canyon through the mountains, past the point where the Lulu Island splash wave will wipe out all the bridges, all past Hope. Okay, I'm past that now. That's been worrying me while I've been living here in the Lower Mainland. People go, well, you can't just think about it. You can't just get to go and live your life. Yeah, okay, I can if I want, but I want to live my life longer than I would if I might live here. So, I'm not worried. I just kind of feel good. I feel like an animal that just kind of knows to get out of the way of the volcano. Maybe I'm doing that too. But anyway, the other volcano is the United States, But I think I'm out of the way of the disaster, just my luck, something in the canyon, I'm getting dry the most. This has been an hour and a half lecture, longer than your most college lectures, so I could do this for quite a while, couldn't I? There's more to be explored about the issues I've raised, the Northwest boundary, the Alaska boundary, how it came about, different events in here in BC, the Nicholas War I've mentioned, the various forts, the building of Port Townsend and the triangle of forts there, and over time I'll be investigating Fort Tongass and all that stuff in Alaska history, and I hope Alaskan people like what I've had to say. They might not like the substance of it, but they like that they're being talked about. But yeah, your history in Alaska, you don't know what you moved in on top of. The Tlingit, no, because you're who they moved in on top of. Right, but the Tlingit were, part of the British ecumen here, the economic zone, even though they were theoretically, or half of them were in Russia, but the ones that weren't on the Lisière, that weren't on which I believe the Lisière really only referred to Baranof and Dal and Prince of Wales Islands, not Juneau or any of it. By the way the treaty is worded, Juneau could be kind of seen to be Lisière, but not Yea and Skagway, and Haines, no. But that was Tlingit land, or Tlingit territory was partitioned, right, between Britain and Russia, effectively. And again, it was just a trading company. Britain had no title. Hudson's Bay Company had no title. This is why it's the unsurrendered territories, because Hudson's Bay Company didn't need title. It was just operating with a trading license, but it was only a trading license. So Sam Sullivan, former mayor of Vancouver, he says Columbia was a country, and Vancouver, Fort Vancouver, he means controlled all the way to the Bering Strait and the Arctic Ocean from Fort Vancouver. Oh, give me a break. That's such sloppy history. It's disgusting. You know, they were forts, and they were embattled forts. You know, but they were trading. They were there to trade, and that's all they were doing. And they had no control beyond the fort, none at all. If anything, what he's doing by that is claiming some kind of primacy for the British Columbia constitutional system, which is rooted in that this Bay Company claims to have controlled all that, to have controlled all that area. No, no, no. It was never ceded. It remains unceded. It remains currently at war. And like I said, there's this. Well, what I meant to get back to with the airspace thing is the U.S. has not closed our airspace the way the Soviets once had. But if it came down to a confrontation between Europe and Asia, allied, whichever part of Asia is allied to Europe, and Russia allied with the United States, and if the U.S. and Russia jointly closed polar airspace, there's not much Denmark and Norway could do about it. They only have a small sliver of the Arctic. This would apply whether they did, maybe they just get Alberta and the Northwest Territories, they get the Beaufort, and then they close the Arctic airspace. And Alert and Resolute are only there to establish Canadian sovereignty. We don't do F all with them. Norway claims that whole area, or not Norway, but a Norwegian made a claim for Norway. It was rural elements that claimed it for Norway. Norway in the 1920s, Norway said no. But Greenland has done a really nice job of letting the Inuit in Greenland be autonomous, and it does fairly well for itself. Whereas the South in Canada just exploits the North. Well, we fund them a lot, but the lifestyle out there is not what it could be compared to what it is in Danish Greenmark. Danish Greenmark. Danish Greenmark, maybe that's a good term. I'm getting old, I'm getting slow, I'm getting confused. I've read all kinds of things. I'm the young professor. My name's Mike Clevin. I'm coming up on an hour and 40 minutes here. I love doing this too much. It's too much because I just want people to hear this someday, to realize the things I'm saying about the geopolitics of Canada being something that people need to wake up about. And Canadians are kept from knowing because our media has been colonized. Our academia has been colonized. Anyway, British Columbia is very colonized. So I'm done talking about it. And the whole point of this whole thing with the American Blitzkriegs, I'd say there's another one pending with Mr. Trump. I don't know what he's got up his sleeve, but he talked about making America bigger and better. And he has this thing about, with this stupid wall, he has this thing about wanting to live up to his campaign promises. So how does the U.S. become bigger? It's not like they want a chunk of Mexico, is it? And where have they threatened to invade at least 4 times, or been menaced, or 4 times, or seem to be about to do 5 times maybe? British Columbia. Anyway, that's the geopolitics of my life. I'm moving to the canyon. I'm going to enjoy the mountains. But yeah, this covers a lot of ground that I wanted to cover in various other videos in detail. But this just kind of lays out the kind of material I know about. And I am going to do a Patreon grant. If you might support it, let me know in the comments. And I'll provide some links when I get a chance to add this, plus a tag so that more people see it. Because British Columbia history, British Columbia geopolitics, First Nations politics, it's all of it. And, American politics, it's all of it. So have a nice day. It's Russian Christmas. So Merry Christmas. I wish I knew how to say that in Russian. I should look it up. Coming up on almost a minute 40. I'm done. Man, that was a long lecture, wasn't it? A ramble. But I hope it covered a lot of interesting material. If you'd like to support me, please let me know. I'll start the Patreon as soon as I get a chance. Once I get resettled, and the computer I have right now is dog slow. My friend's giving me one, and I have funds to help move thanks to the government. Anyways, so I'm looking forward to my new place. I'll have much more time to make videos and be more cogent up there.